We listen. And the gospel today was, you might say, far from being the good news of our salvation. What do we hear? We hear of conflicts. And all we have to do every day is either put on the computer, put on the TV, or strangely enough, pick up a newspaper, which I still do. And we see of conflicts all over. We see conflicts in Egypt. We see conflicts in various countries in Africa, one tribe against another. We see conflicts in our own country here, the traditionalists against the liberals, those who are so vehemently opposed to a type of birth control, and yet we sanction capital punishment. So there's many divisions. And we're not going to talk this morning about which is the right road to follow, about specifically, okay? But the purpose that Jesus came was not so much to cause division, but what are the consequences of the coming of Christ? What are the consequences that come from his message of peace? Are we true sons and daughters of the loving God? We live in the same world as our brothers and sisters of different faith backgrounds, but we're supposed to have different values. Supposed to have different values. We're called, as Matthew tells us in that famous Sermon on the Mount, to be the light of the world and the salt of the earth. Jesus came among us in the Gospel of John and tells us that he is the light of the world. And then in Matthew's Gospel, we hear Jesus tell us that we are the light of the world and the salt of the earth. Light is something that illuminates. Salt is something that preserves, but if it's not used for the right purpose, sometimes salt can sting. Sometimes salt can cause more division. What are we called to be? What are we called to do? And this is the question that that's put to each one of us. We're not going to you're not going to leave here this morning with an answer. We're not going to tell you what to do. But how many of you remember that terrific Walt Disney movie, Pinocchio? It might have been a while, but it's a good one. Maybe we can relate to it because a lot of us have wooden heads too. Like I said last week, thick-headed Italian, okay? But there's a great lesson for us in there, and it's from a great song. Let your conscience be your God. And this is what transformed the church in the Second Vatican Council. Truly transformed the church. Because prior to this, as you know, those of you that were brought up in the Catholic Church, it was this or that. And of course, if you weren't Catholic, forget about going to heaven. But when we have the conscience to guide us, then the responsibility falls where? On each one of us. We can't say, well, the devil told me to do it, or the church said this is it. No. It comes down to each one of us. And how do we take responsibility for our actions. We might look at what are called the 7 deadly sins. It might be a little more traditional than we usually get here. But what are these 7 deadly sins? The sin of pride, the sin of covetousness, the sin of lust, the sin of envy, the sin of anger, the sin of gluttony, and the sin of sloth. Now, we're not going to go into each one of them, but if you'd like a list of them to peruse on your own, I'd be more than glad to give you the list again. But a lot of people think that we can just sin against another without looking at all of these different manners of breaking God's law. The person who is slothful is the one who wants to attach their wagon to the latest fad and to go along with the crowd and to forget about what their true value system should be. The sin of anger is something that we experience every day. All you have to do is drive on 95, and if you don't get angry, there's something wrong with you. But how do we contain that anger? Do we just sort of forget about it, or do we say, damn it, I'm going to get him, and you pull ahead of the car? This is insane. And yet it's done all the time. So it's up to us. How do we handle? How do we come to handle the consequences of Jesus' coming into the world? Look at the first reading. The prophet Jeremiah. What happens to him? He's speaking out, and they don't want to hear him. So they throw him in a well, deep well, and he's sinking in the mud. And then who happens to come along? Someone who wasn't of the class of the Jewish people at the time, but an Ethiopian and a eunuch, another person who was considered not worthy. And how is Jeremiah saved? The Ethiopian, the reject, the outcast goes to talk for him, and the king says, pull him out of the well. Jesus came, welcomed everybody, and they called him a sinner. He welcomed everyone to the table, and they were constantly looking for ways to shut him up. And what happens? God raises him, because he came with a message of truth. Each one of us is called, my brothers and sisters, to be that true son, true daughter of God's presence. Not just certain people at certain times, but 24/7, 365 days a year, we're called to be that instrument, that messenger of God's peace. Pray for me as I pray for you. And may God bless us and keep us. May God's face shine upon us and give us peace, now and always. Amen.